Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching from in the world today. Welcome to today's Toolbox Presents webinar. I'll be your host for today, Stuart King, Good Practice Manager for Human Performance and Power Systems at the Energy Institute. This is the, what is this, the sixth, I believe, or maybe the seventh in our webinar series for this year. This is a series of webinars focused on learning from incidents. That could be learning from incidents as a topic, or it could be learning from particular incidents. Today's focus is, of course, around lifting operations. Our next webinar is focusing on Just Culture, and that's on the 12th of July. If you're interested in Just Culture and want to register for that event, you can do so from the Toolbox website. The webinars that we're putting on this year are really to do a few things, really. One is to, of course, share good practice with wider industry, but they're all in Toolbox web app. This is a completely free to use web app. It's for sharing lessons learned from incidents, particularly with supervisors and frontline staff, as well as HSC managers and others who need to learn from incidents as well. It contains around about, over 500 learning resources at the moment, including lots of videos, as well as incident alerts. It's updated regularly, or usually daily. It's available in 10 different languages as well. And as I said, it's completely free to access. So if you're interested in finding out about that app, just go to toolbox.energyinst.org and start using it. Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the Toolbox website in a couple of days' time. All participants will be muted, except, of course, for the presenters today. If you have questions for the presenters, and hopefully you will have questions, but do post those in the Q&A function. Please do not post questions into the chat box because we won't be checking that. But if you have questions, put those in the Q&A function. And after the webinar ends, I believe a short survey will appear. Please do take a couple of webinars in future. If you are a member of the Energy Institute, don't forget that today's webinar can be used for your continual professional development. You can find on our website a template so that you can, I believe you can fill that in to keep a record of your continual professional development and what you learned today. If you're a member of another organization, I'm sure that you could probably use this to count towards your CPD there as well. And if you're not a member of any organization or the Energy Institute, then do consider becoming a member of the Institute and visit our website at www.energyinst.org to find out more. Who are we as the Energy Institute? So the Energy Institute is the professional body for the global energy industry. We're not a trade association. We're essentially a good practice, good science, good practice organization. We're here to deliver good practice, knowledge, professionalism across the depth and breadth of the energy sector, whether that's oil and gas, offshore wind, solar, you name it. We're a not-for-profit organization, a registered charity, and we're essentially here to bring expertise together to tackle urgent global challenges, whether that's health and safety or whether that's issues to do with the energy transition. We have something like 600 good practice guidance documents on our website. That's publishing.energyinst.org. Those good practice documents are, many of which are completely free to access, range from topics such as human factors and human performance, asset integrity, fuel quality, process safety, etc., etc. So there's a wealth of resources there. We'll probably hear about one or two of our guidance documents in today's presentations later today. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We've got 4 speakers today lined up. So our first speaker is Nick Hough. Nick is a technical advisor for the International Marine Contractors Association. And amongst other things, Nick supports the IMCA Health, Safety, Security and Environment Committee and is responsible for all IMCA safety flashes and safety statistics. And Nick is also responsible for supporting the development of safety promotional material and guidance. Our second speaker is Utibe Akpanudo from Shell. Utibe is a lifting and hoisting subject matter expert with 18 years experience in lifting and hoisting operations in the oil and gas industry, including offshore and onshore, and is also a certified mobile crane and forklift truck operator. Our third speaker is Danny Travis from Siemens Gamesa. Danny is a successful and respected lifting operations professional with an extensive background in the planning, management and execution of safe lifting operations in the renewable sector. He's a subject matter expert who is actively playing a leading role in helping define industry standards and best practice. And last but not least, our fourth speaker today is Alan Smith from Drops Global. Alan is a global industry focal point on dropped object prevention across all aspects of oil and gas operations. He's party to the validation and publication of all drops best practice guidance and documentation, and is also the principal drops trainer. So welcome to our speakers. We're looking forward to your presentations. Our first speaker, Nick Hough. So Nick, if you can, understand you're going to share your screen, so I will turn my camera off and hand over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm just finding that I can't share my screen until you stop sharing yours.
Yeah, that's fine. Let me work out how I stop sharing. There it is, right, okay.
There we go, splendid. If you could confirm for me then that you can see what you need to see, that would be great. Can you see it?
Not yet, actually.
Not yet, my apologies. If I could press share, that might work.
Yep, there it is.
Splendid. Good day to everybody. Some good news and some bad news. The good news is you've only got me for 15 minutes. The bad news is in practice, I thought I had slightly more time, so I've prepared for 23 or 24 minutes, which means I'm going to have to précis on the hop. The other news is I'm the second team in this presentation. The person that was to present, my colleague Mark Ford, is not able to do so. What this does mean then is I've got a couple of slides here. This is the agenda here, where was going to be a brief overview, which I will now have to skip, but that's fine. I think most people present will know and understand what IMCA is. We'll discuss some common hazards of offshore lifting operations. We'll look at a few lessons learned, and then some IMCA recommended practice documents we'll cover briefly as well. This slide's worth a couple of seconds. Then that's the IMCA Lifting and Rigging Committee, the actual members you can see on the web, but that's the actual corporations involved there. But I'll get straight into the meat of where we're going then this morning or this afternoon. Some common hazards then of lifting in the offshore context. When I looked into this, what I found that it's quite a nuanced and blurred list. That's what I'll come back to a number of times. Yeah, just a minute while I set this stopwatch going so I know where I'm going. They all blur into one. So rather like the IOGP life-saving rules, any crane incident, it might be a crane equipment failure, it might be dropped objects, swinging loads might come about because of insufficient lift planning. There's a kind of blurring of what's going on will come up again and again. Let's look firstly then at equipment failure. Electrical faults are quite common there. When a crane's in constant use, it's inevitable that certain components are going to fail. Some of those failures might be sticking contacts, some might be earth faults, some might be electronic component failure as well. We had a safety flash about a year and a half ago from the HSE, where there was a fire in an electrical cabinet, and the problem there was that the contacts hadn't been properly and appropriately lubricated, and there was a fire. So sticking contacts could be an issue. Corrosion, I find certainly as one who collects safety flashes, is certainly an issue, and especially in difficult to reach places. If we look at dropped objects, Mark has provided for me an excellent list, 10 there, you can read them, 10 different causes of dropped objects in the context of cranes. And when I look through them, it's quite interesting. With almost all of them, there's perhaps only one or two, nearly all of them, what it comes down to is human factors: inadequate risk assessment, failure perhaps to identify dropped object hazards, human factors, operator error, poor behavior, complacency or neglect, inadequate procedures, bad planning, poor housekeeping, neglected or homemade tools. That all these things, with, as I say, with one or two only exceptions, they all come down to human factors. And the HSSE Core Committee is looking very closely at a possible seminar in early 2023, and human factors and human performance will be one of the primary topics we look at. If we drill down further, then swinging load. Now, swinging loads are dramatic, of course, but as we'll see later in the slide pack, not quite as common, although the consequences are quite outstanding, not quite as common as some of the other causes that we'll highlight today. What I'll do now then, a little picture there, we point out that even in calm seas, there'll always be some small or unsolicited movement of a suspended object. So in marginal conditions, though, you could easily get into a situation where objects start swinging in and out of control. And I think we've all seen it. Additionally, as you can see from the diagram there at bottom left, you can get into a scenario where there'll be forces on the crane jib and on the crane, which is not entirely designed for. Perhaps there'll be side loading and also offloading. But let's look at this. This is, if I can just play this. You have to decide is when are you going to start running. Vai agora. Arreia agora e para no container. I think that's all we need to see there. The next video that's been provided from Mark's comment as well. I wouldn't like to see him happen. While we're playing this video, moving loads of in motion here and what have you. Depends on the weight of the load and the length of the height of the crane jib. Some accidental loss of the crane hook. The crane hook failing to rookie to get hearing moment and big hearing moment. You can get a scenario where you move the load onto the all of a sudden will highlight that. Here's a generator, well, I think it's a generator, it's a large object about to be lifted onto a vessel. We get it rigged up, we pick it up, and we lift it across. No further comment needed, perhaps. What about incorrect or inappropriate rigging? In order to lift the load properly, we need to know the weight of the load. That's the rigger's responsibility. The crane team really do need to have an absolute understanding. Most equipment or most stuff that's regularly lifted may have it stamped on, but sometimes not. There needs to be very regular and very thorough and very frequent inspection of equipment. Well, that's something we pick up in safety flashes and something we'll mention in a couple of slides' time. The other scenario that can crop up, and I've certainly seen that when I've been offshore, is that the slings or the lifting equipment no longer have the appropriate labeling or tagging on. Such equipment ought not to be used. Another thing I've certainly seen in safety flashes is homemade kit and inappropriately fabricated devices that have been modified in one way or another. That's not really on either. Also not using the correct sling device or hitch. Sling protection, we'll see that in a minute or two. The sling hasn't been properly protected. And then there's the failure to understand the integrity of the load. That can also cause a number of problems. Insufficient lift planning, categorization and considerations. There's a wide range of lift operations, inshore, offshore, subsea, and to say that they're all routine or they're all non-routine doesn't always work. What might be routine for one company because they do it all the time and they do it regularly will be non-routine for another, and that will involve extra and additional planning. So it's vital then that we have appropriate categorization, and so there needs to be an appropriate risk assessment made. Sometimes it needs to be specific and detailed, and sometimes a generic plan will work. As regards lift plan considerations, all lifts are exposed to various dynamic effects due to differences in hoisting or lowering speed, crane or vessel motions and load motions, and all that needs to be taken into account. Are we lifting from the shore to the vessel? Are we lifting from the vessel to the shore? Are we lifting inside a vessel? Are we lifting in different seas? Are we lifting from a platform to a vessel or a vessel to a platform? All of that needs to be taken into account. It's been suggested then that we look at a handful of real incidents, and that's what we'll do now for the next couple of minutes. When I looked through all this, I'd selected something like 400 or 500 different safety flashes, all of them involving lifting. And it was interesting, just on a search of words, we have to be very careful what conclusions we draw statistically, but just on a search of those words, crane equipment failure formed around about half of all the incidents that I saw. Dropped objects, something like 40%, and then swinging loads, not many swinging loads, just one or two. Incorrect, appropriate, inappropriate rigging, around about 5%, and about 10% was insufficient lift planning. But a point I already made then is that these all blur into one. One can lead to the other. Let's look at 5 flashes in slightly more detail in turn. Here we see a sling failed. 8 ton of ROV and tether management system fell 30 centimeters. As you can see in the top picture there, bent the ROV quite badly. So the whole 8 tons was directly slung onto the crane hook with a 10-ton fiber sling choked around the main lifting eye. The sling snapped, or rather it failed, and choked around a sharp edge with no protection. It failed suddenly and completely. What were the actions taken then? Better lift planning, better supervision. Let's not use improvised solutions. That was a key one there. And better protection of any edges, as we've already seen. The edges need to be protected, not just sharp edges, but corners as well. This one, slightly more recent. 9-kilogram item fell 15 meters from a pipeline tower. Certainly would have been a fatality if it hit anybody. Parts were being changed out and they were being put into baskets to be lowered out. One such basket started swaying, hit the crane, and a part fell out. Some points here. The task was considered routine. It's possible that complacency played a part. It's also possible that sea conditions and darkness played a part. I think perhaps could have been better illuminated. Risk assessments were certainly found to be inadequate, and the lock on the basket gate was found also to be inadequate. What did they do? What were the lessons learned? They found then that had they slewed the crane in a different way, it might have been possible to avoid the basket striking the crane. Covers and nets fitted on the basket might have been good. The check of all lifting appliances, again, the thorough check all the time, don't overload, and better communication. This is something that certainly I see again and again in safety flashes, and something we'll see in the next slide or so. Better communication, in this case, between the crane operator and the banksman. You've probably seen the video of this. The top sides became prematurely unstable. They lifted off its structure while it was being installed. There were people nearby, but fortunately no one was hurt. That certainly had the potential to be for there to be multiple fatalities. And the lessons there exhaustive expert verifications. I think the key there is meticulous and careful planning, preparation again and again. These companies do say then that they'll be planning this kind of thing for 4 years and then do it in 15 minutes, but it's the 4 years that matters, I think, the 4 years of preparation and planning. Rigging are not appropriate then. Here we saw rigging being recovered to deck with missing parts. A nut was missing from one of the shackles, cotter pin split, no thorough visual inspection, no specific checklist for that rigging. And the rigging team hadn't been properly trained. So the actions that were taken there were thorough and frequent inspection of all similar arrangements, a revised checklist to include specific items, and a thorough visual inspection, and then proper training and preparation of the rigging team, make sure they're familiar with the material they're handling. This was a classic. Cherry picker, you might definitely say a complex load. So a cherry picker was lifted onto a vessel to do some work, and then it was lifted off again. And when it was lifted off, you've got this, as you see in the picture. Now, part of the challenge was one crew lifted it on, or one shift lifted it on, but another shift lifted it off. So there wasn't an adequate handover. There was poor communication. Lift detail, lift information was not effectively communicated between the crews. And the rigging arrangement for the unit created a clash. So there was obviously a problem with the center of gravity. And the lessons there, specific lift plans for specific lifts, and ensuring effective handover of key information at shift change and handover. And then the requirement then that for particularly for complex loads, complex objects, everyone should understand what's going on. Just some broad conclusions from my point of view as someone who sees all the safety flashes. There's overlap between causes. Nothing's simple. It's all nuanced. Lift planning and preparation needs to be specific, detailed, meticulous, and thorough. Better supervision and oversight comes out. And inspection and checklists, check, check, check. Communication between crane drivers and the team on the ground, especially at handover, the whole communication thing is always worth stressing. Training, competence of our crews. Do they know what they're doing for specific issues? And then specifics, protect the edges, cover loads, don't overload. Just a finishing off in the last couple of minutes. This is some of our recommended practice, which is available to members to look at. The first one, guidelines for lifting operations. That's the Bible, as it were, of IMCA's documents on lifting. Currently, it's under revision by an industry work group, and we would expect a revision to be out in July or August of this year. The second one, wire rope integrity management. That's a worthwhile document, taking into account all the harsh environments that the wire ropes are used in. The guy rope, that's the third one there, manufacture and safe use of cable laid slings and grommets, thoroughly technical. And then the fourth one, selection and safe use of high performance fiber slings. So that's just 4 of the lifting documents that are available for members for recommended practice. And that, I think, ladies and gentlemen, will be it. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nick. Great presentation. I see there's a question down the bottom. We'll get round to questions at the end after we've had our four presentations. If you've got any other questions for Nick or any of the other speakers as you hear them, please do put those in the Q&A box. So I'd like to welcome our second speaker for today. So Utibe, would you like to try to share your screen and I'll hand over to you.
Many thanks for the opportunity once again. My name is Utibe Akpanudo, lives on Hoisting SME, working for Shell company. It's an opportunity to join this session with to share learnings based on incidents recorded, just to continue to educate the community for learning purpose, and then be able to put some of the best practices into action to prevent a similar incident from any of our industry and in our community network. Thank you. So this is about the monorail hoist action alert. Looking at a couple of learnings we had in shell operation, which allowed us to put some mitigations and to ensure that those incidents does not happen again. So the agenda for this discussion is going to look at the introductions and the incident summary, and then action, and then opportunity for questions and answer. So a brief background of these incidents we talked about. It's within a span of 10 months, we recorded about 8 incidents that involved overhead traveling lifting equipment, which are falling from height to the floor. And we also noticed within the industry, a similar incidents have happened, which prompt a speedy response to ensure that potential fatality or injury damage to equipment is halted. So you can look at the picture on my presentation. We have the picture on my left. It's a post-incident skin location where the incidents happened in a way that the hoist that was used for the depression actually dropped. You can see where the location where this dropped. This is really a very high pole, assuming that there were no control to keep people away from line of fire. So on my right on this picture, this is the post-incident skin location 2. You can see within the purple dot there, this was the position of the lifting supervisor supervising this lifting operation. You can see as well the drop location where the component of that, the lifted component actually fell to the ground, and also a compressor unit of the compressor unit that was lifted. This resonated with some of our earlier discussion from Nick that about it dropped, and then the need to ensure that the lifting operation is adequately planned. So we cannot re-emphasize more or enough on the need to be sure that pre-use inspection is done, and that has to be taken into consideration before the lift is done. So I'll go to my next slide to probably look at a typical scenarios of illustration of this monorail, and probably the end stops, which is one of the key discussion point, learning point in this webinar. You can see from the picture here, this is a typical runway beam or monorail, and then you probably will see here the end stops. The end stops has an elbow bar that is secured to cover the full width of the beam. Then you can see on the upstream of it here, this is the structure that supports the entire monorail and probably the runway beam. I can as well see the end stop in some cases is bolted just to facilitate. In some cases, you need to remove it and then install the trolley. So this has a couple of bolts here that has to be designed to specification. So emphasis should always be before this is used, is have to be sure that they are fit for purpose and they are firm, and there is no any means of modifying it, and then it has to meet the standard requirement of which it's meant to serve. So I'll go next to the other presentation for us to look at why it happened. Below are some of the causes we identified in the various incidents, and then there were some common causes across the incidents. As I showed, not every cause was present in every of the incidents. As I begin to look at the common causes, one of them which was inadequate size end stopper on the monorail beam to prevent the trolley hoist from dislodging from the monorail beam. These were found in 4 of the 8 incidents. Inadequate size end stopper in 4 of the 8 incidents. That represent about 50% of the incident that happened within that span of 10 months. And then we also notice variations, absent or unsuitable in pre-use inspection after installation of the lifting equipment at height, which in some cases pose a lot of challenge folks out there, guys at the front line, assessing the height where they need to inspect this lifting equipment before use. We also observed that there were quite a competence issue with the operator of this monorail and then the overhead traveling equipment. Competence in the sense that not everyone, irrespective of any piece of equipment, one is expected to undergo some competence training, be able to understand how the safety impact HSE exposure of every equipment. So that was a gap that was noticed as well. Then inspection and maintenance schedule did not include key OEM requirements. Every piece of equipment has a manual instruction on how it should be installed, how it should be operated safely, and also at intervals, it should be inspected and maintained. In some cases, the entity maintaining this equipment do not have the expertise to also inspect equipment. Various industry regulations outline some inspection intervals which need to be done for every piece of equipment. And then we also found out that the end stoppers were inadequate due to modification of trolleys with different capacities and dimensions after initial installation. This points to a fact that for any modification to be done in any lifting equipment, it has to be authorized by the OEM. Modification is not, local modification is not allowed because of the risks exposed. But if for whatsoever reason modification has to be done, they must undergo a structured MOC process. This which will identify some risks associated with that modifications and then mitigations. And there should be some action party. It has to go through the technical authorities that should be able to provide some solutions that would allow that post modifications. Then this a set of checklists have been done to be sure the equipment being modified fit for purpose, the competence of the personnel that actually carry out the modification, and then once it's reinstated, it's being tested and verified. So those processes was what we observed were lacking in that of the four the incidents that we recorded, and then we decided to put some few actions in place to prevent that. So I would say that next slide is all about the lesson learned. A couple of lessons were learned as a result of that incident, and that really stopped that. Probably the last one we had was that in all of operation grouply or as a group, this lesson learned was also cascaded to failures asset, which we want to share for learning purpose as well here. Lifting equipment should be installed correctly according to the design and for its intended purpose. Every lifting equipment has a specific purpose is what it's been designed for. So installing it has to follow that design philosophy to be sure that it's being maintained, it's being operated, and then it's being stored in terms of storage in a safe manner. Then lesson learned also include the pre-use inspection, which has to incorporate a functional test and a dry run. This is without load, should be performed before every monorail, hoist, and trolley is being used. What do we mean by this? We mean that before you actually rigged a load on the hook of the hoist, you need to either it's a mechanically operated, like I said, manually operated or powered operated hoist. The operator need to undergo a pre-use check, hoist it up, travel along the path, travel along the beam, check that everything is fine, and then check all the load securing and everything is in good condition and ticked up before the operation can commence. We also look at the operator competence. Operator competency operator competency requirement must be in place prior to use of overhead equipment. It's very key. It's a safety critical device, and the person operating this equipment must undergo a process. As let me re-emphasize that you can, if you are not competent as an operator, you may travel with a load and be using the end stops just to as a primary means to stop the load. No, the end stops supposed to be a fail-safe system. It's not from time to time you travel with speed and also with intention that this is just there to be used intentionally or from time to time to stop the load. There are risks to this. If you travel a load with speed and then it gets in contact with the end stop, definitely there will be some safety concern. It will introduce a shock loading and also it will make the load to swing. So in that case, operator that is not competent, that is not qualified, that does not understand the operating philosophy, the HSE exposure will definitely not be aware of this risk. So training is very key. Then OEM specification that incorporate maintenance and inspection testing requirement must be adequately detailed in the maintenance system. Some organizations, they have a routine, robust maintenance system, but you discover that in some cases, the monorail inspection and all that is not all there. So it was a lesson that we learned, and then we cascade that every asset must have a documented inspection schedule for every monorail hoist system. And then we also assess the risks thoroughly before using any alternate method of securement for overhead crane hoist. What do we mean by this? For the traveling hoist, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is actually secured either by welding or any other mechanical means to also upstream structures. You can see my cursor, there are some structures where the runway beam is being welded, or in this case is welded, the one in the picture here. So the means of which is being secured is a mean that needs to be verified. In some cases, it has to go through a structural engineer assessment to be sure that, because the securement mechanism is also need to be tested, and all the welding process, if it's bolted, whatsoever mean must be fit for purpose to be able to withstand the intended use of the load. Note that both the load, the hoist, depends on the securement of that trolley to the upstream structure. So it's important that if there are some alternate method which is being considered, that must go through a process that is technically assessed and also ensure that it's fit for purpose. And then the last one, based on the part of the lesson learned here, is to ensure end stops are installed and adequate to cover the full width of the beam. It can either be during the design or commissioning, or if there is any need for modifications during the life of the overhead equipment. I want to re-emphasize here, it's not required for you to modify any lifting equipment without going through their structured and approved process. OEM has to support that before that happens. So end stops, in some cases where we find out that some of them cover about 25% of the width of the beam, which is not the best practice or the appropriate. The most appropriate is that the end stop must cover the full width, as you can see in this picture. It has to cover the full width of the beam. This is to prevent any incidents of sudden dislodgement or the continuous, as mentioned, that is not advisable to use as a primary means to stop the hoist from dislodging. Is you have to intentionally know where you are, the load, you want to pick the load, or where you want to stop the load. Once you get to that point, you have to gradually reduce your speed. So you should be able to get at a natural position without necessarily coming in there with force and then to impact the end stop. So that is the most important thing key here. End stop has to ensure that is fully covered to prevent any incidents. Then some few actions which can also be a lesson, a best practice to the community for and different assets to use. What we did was ensure that design and commissioning requirements are outlined in our lifting and hoisting guide. So in a local procedure, you have to be sure that you have this specification is also indicated there to be as a control, that the end stop has to cover the full width. So this is one of the few best practice we consider, and which we also implemented, that can as well help other community to ensure this incidence is by design. We don't give any room for for error. Then the second action was identify and address existing overhead equipment. So what we have to do in this case is to inspect the existing overhead lifting equipment, identify those who have this stopper, which the stopper do not cover the full width of this. You can probably put a note down, a register down. You undergo a process as a formal process to ensure that a redesign of the end stopper is done to cover the full width of the beam. Then as well, we require and confirm that overhead equipment has securement sufficient and appropriate to prevent the lifting equipment from falling. The securement there is the whole traveling hoist system. You have to do a sweep and be sure that has been secured to the beam or to any structure that is keeping it in position. That structure is robust enough to be able to withstand the impact of those the hoist and the load. We also, as an action, ensure that OEM inspection and maintenance requirements for lifting equipment are captured and followed in asset maintenance system. So it's also good to have this automated system, not probably, yes, some would prefer to have in a search in the desktop of their computer, but it's good to have it in a system that can send a reminder, that a system that could be able to self-automated, can just like SAP, which will be able to send a reminder or probably capture this information for prompt attention. And when it's not done, it should be able to send a deviation. It's able to send a deviation, and that system will go red to ensure that this maintenance routine has not been carried out. In that way, that will help for tracking and then for escalation purpose. And then the last action which we took, which we also had as a best practice, to review the local and lifts and hoisting competence requirement, ensure that they meet the global competency and training framework of our organization. So in this, I would strongly recommend that each individuals, operators who operate lifting and hoisting equipment, they must undergo a formal training process assessment, a structured assessment, to be sure that they have been deemed competent. And then if there is their recertification is due, there should be a tracker, a system to ensure that they undergo a refresher to keep them abreast of the newer technology in the industry, and also about some risks that they need to be aware. So it's important that everyone who operates lifting equipment undergo a formal assessment and training purpose. So with this action in place, we should be assure ourselves and our processes that is robust to allow us prevent some of the reoccurring of monorail end stop incidents. So this will be my last slide. I just want to thank you for your time to listen in. I'm very open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Utibe, for the interesting presentation. And if you have questions for Utibe, please do post those in the Q&A box. And I'd like to welcome our third speaker for today, Danny Travis. So, Danny, I will stop sharing and see if you're able to share your screen.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Can you see that, Stuart?
Not just yet. Something's happening. Yep, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so just to, I guess just to give everybody a little bit of background information, I work in offshore renewables, offshore wind industry. And we have a safety organization called the G+, which is run by the Energy Institute that publishes annual incident data. And I guess somewhat concerningly, for the last 3 years in a row, lifting operations has been the work activity with the highest number of overall incidents and the highest number of high potential incidents. So the G+ defines a high potential incident as any incident that had the potential to cause fatality or life-changing injury. So as you can see, within the offshore wind industry, lifting operations is there's a massive amount of focus on this at the moment in terms of how we manage that risk more effectively. And my presentation is looking at some of the steps that Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy have taken to do that. My presentation is representative of lifting operations as a whole, but I have chosen a particular incident to kind of construct the presentation round. So please bear with me. Industry trends with lifting operations. A significant number of these lifting operations occur during really low complexity operations and maintenance activities. I think the incident data that was released yesterday for 2021 is about 53% now of all incidents are happening during really low complexity operations and maintenance lifting operations. Industry training and competence thresholds have been historically quite low for slinger signalers, crane operators, etc. Standards of lift planning are generally quite poor in this area of industry. In some cases, they're entirely absent. There's a very common use of generic risk assessments, which in some instances are used in place of lift plans, safe systems of work. Deviations from prescribed lifting methods are very, very common. And I think, as Nick mentioned before, quite often poor procurement, selection and use of appropriate lifting accessories. So I've just put a slide together just to show you the anatomy of a turbine, just so that I'm not using any terminology that anybody's not familiar with. The basic makeup of our turbines. You've got the nacelle at the top, where all the mechanical and the electronic workings are, the rotor, the tower, and the transition piece. And for the sake of this presentation, it largely involves lifting tools, equipment, materials, consumables from the transition piece up to the nacelle or back down again, depending on which way we're operating. Almost all these days, every wind turbine that's constructed is fitted with some kind of crane system to ensure that tools and equipment can be hoisted up to make sure that we can service and repair them. These crane systems vary between different manufacturers and models, but they include things such as electric mounted chain hoist systems, hydraulically operated loader cranes, rail or runway beam mounted hoists or winches. There are other couple of variations as well, but they differ significantly, and they tend to be an afterthought to the design of the turbine. So the turbine itself is designed, and then we wonder how we can get tools and equipment up. So quite often you get what you're given. But the way that the load is brought into the nacelle depends on the turbine design. So sometimes they can be hoisted through hatches in the floor. Sometimes they'll come in through hatches in the side of the nacelle. And in other occasions, they'll actually be lifted in through the roof, through open canopy doors. And each different method introduces different challenges in terms of the sizes of load, the shapes, the dimensions, etc. And also high underhook clearances, which is prevalent in the incident that we're going to talk about here. So in 2020, at one of our sites in Germany, we had a lifting bag that was dropped. So a lot of our tools and equipment go up in these certified lifting bags, manufactured for the offshore industry, relatively bespoke to some of the jobs that we do, but most of our tools, equipment, etc., goes up to the turbines in these bags. In 2020, we dropped one of these in Germany. Now, as I've said before, this presentation is based on an incident, but dropped bags within this lifting within the renewables industry has been endemic. It's happened a lot. So this is representative of the wider industry. So a little bit of background. Technicians were trying to crane down 4 lifting bags simultaneously through the crane hatch in the floor. So this is a turbine with a hatch in the bottom. When the bags were freed, so they got snagged on the frame. When the bags were freed, one of the bags became detached from the 4-leg sling. That resulted in the load falling 95 meters down to the transition piece at the bottom of the turbine, where it hit a access gate and came to rest on the transition piece. These lifting bags, it depends on what they have in them. They can range in weight from 25 kilos, probably up to 300 kilos. So it goes without saying that a fall from that height, if it had struck someone, would have undoubtedly been a fatality. The access gate and its hinges were damaged, and the equipment that was inside the bag was totally destroyed, which stands to reason. Unfortunately, nobody was actually working on the transition piece at the time, so there were no injuries. And again, you know, historically, that's been the case when this has happened before. So you could say that you know, that we've been incredibly lucky. So this is a recreation of the incident. The photograph's not great because I've had to zoom it up for the presentation, but as you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 lifting bags, and they're trying to lower them down through this hatch here. As you can see, they've got snagged at this end and snagged at the other end. So the 4 bags lifted together simultaneously were too big to fit through the crane hatch without snagging. Bags were known to snag quite regularly. It wasn't uncommon, and you can actually see an individual's foot here, wasn't uncommon for a technician to maybe stick his foot through and push them through the hatch. Whilst there was a generic risk assessment for the task, there hadn't been a lift plan developed by a competent person, an appointed person or lift planner. So it was just being done under a generic risk assessment. The 4-leg accessory used to attach the bag wasn't actually suitable for the crane type that we were using here. So the sling, the actual leg, the sling leg length was too long. So you perhaps can't see on the photograph, but the actual sling had been passed through the bag handles and doubled up in a cradle hitch, if you like, back up to the crane hook. When we actually read through the instructions for use of the sling during the incident investigation, that was actually prohibited. It was, yeah, they shouldn't have been used in that way. But they were poorly specified because obviously they were too long. But they had to be doubled back because when lifting into these turbines, this is a roof-mounted nacelle crane, so there are height under hook issues. So that the overall load height, including rigging, has to be below 1.35 meters. And if it's above that, you can't get it safely into the turbine. So the reason that they'd been doubled up was because they'd been poorly specified, couldn't get the bags in, hence why they were being used in that way. And it was just common to have been done on this site. And although no one was working on a transition piece at the time the bag was dropped, because there wasn't a lift plan in place, because there wasn't a safe system of work for this, there wasn't actually a requirement for there to be any kind of exclusion zone. So the fact that nobody got injured or hurt was luck and not judgment, if you like. So some of the lessons that have been learned from this incident and from an array of these types of incidents happening across the industry. So at other SGRE locations, lift plans already existed for lifting into the D8 platform. So one of the nuances with doing lifting operations in the renewable industry is the equipment's common, a bit like car manufacturers. So car manufacturers might make 5 or 6 different models of car. And we're pretty much the same. So to some degree, it doesn't matter where you put a wind turbine. It could be in Germany, it could be in the UK, it could be in Belgium or the Netherlands. The actual equipment, the internal workings, the gubbins, the crane, etc., they're all the same. So at other locations, we actually already had lift plans in place for this D8 platform. And interestingly, where we did have lift plans in place, they had already developed bespoke lifting accessories for this platform, and they were designed with the platform in mind. So they were the correct length, so they didn't have to be doubled back up. They could lift lifting bags correctly by attaching the hooks to the bags. And it was a 3-leg sling, not a 4-leg sling. So by removing a leg from the sling arrangement, it wasn't actually possible to lift 4 bags. Therefore, you're eliminating the problem. You know, if you can't lift 4 bags, then you can't have the same incident. So it was already known at other sites that lifting 3 bags was problematic, and sites had already taken steps to prevent this. And this is one of the things that we found quite often with lifting incidents that we've had, is some sites will say, oh, we're aware of this. We've already, we've designed a piece of equipment for this, or we've stopped doing that, or we've got a checklist to make sure that we can check for this. And I guess in terms of this being lessons learned, one of the things that we weren't great at a couple of years ago is actually joining up the dots and making sure that the lessons learned are applied everywhere, not just at one location, not just at one site, or within one country, within the region that I look after lifting operations for. So yeah, just to reiterate what I've just said, so knowledge from past incidents, best practice, lessons learned wasn't being widely implemented across all STRE locations. What you'd find is there'd be an incident and a site might say, oh yeah, we stopped doing that 2 years ago, or we changed lifting bags 6 months ago, or so yeah, we really weren't joined up in our thinking in that way. And I guess really touching on where we're going with this is despite maintaining several thousand turbines across approximately 30 sites in Northern Europe, the crane technology and its uses is common across only a small handful of platforms, which obviously leads on to kind of where we're going with solutions and what was implemented afterwards. We went down the route wherever we could of standardization. So lift plans now for service O&M activities are centrally owned and are developed for the whole region by competent lift planners. So we literally have a lift plan for each of the different platforms we have. The idea being now is if you're working in the Netherlands, if you're working in Germany, Belgium, or the UK, if you're on the same equipment type with the same crane, you are working in the same method. So we have entirely standardized it. So we've taken the best bits of what sites have in terms of the equipment that they've developed, in terms of slinging arrangements, lifting bags, etc., and we've brought that together under one lift plan. So with a handful of lift plans, we've standardized the processes. One of the benefits of that is if we have a safety or a quality issue with one of our cranes or one of our lifting operations, we can incorporate that into our safe system of work. The safe systems of work are all managed digitally. So our technicians have access to them through a system called Fluix. So if we make a change to a lift plan with a safety concern, it goes out to the whole fleet. And when technicians access this documentation on Fluix, it's being updated automatically to the newest version all the time. So we can effectively share lessons learned and improvements made to the safe system of work across the whole region instantly, near enough. We've also gone through mass standardization of lifting accessories and lifting bags. So we're kind of taking this one step on now. Equipment's being designed specifically for the different limitations that we have with the different platforms. And we're actually starting to take that one step further. And rather than just simply designing equipment for each turbine type, we're actually looking to optimize it. So we're looking at how we can design equipment so that we can reduce the number of lifting operations that we do. Obviously, the fewer lifting operations we do, the fewer people we put at risk. It's that straightforward. So massive piece of work undergone in terms of that and standardizing what we do. Lift plans obviously now define prescribed methods for securely attaching all loads, which is something that we didn't have before. The rigging arrangement, how a load was attached to the crane with a generic risk assessment, just didn't exist. So the number of component parts for a turbine is finite. There are only so many different parts that are in a turbine. So what we've been able to do is effectively map out all the lifting operations that will be undertaken on any of our turbines and develop individual load cases for everything. So anything that's not in a lifting bag has its own dedicated load case where a competent appointed person we'll plan how that's lifted. Again, that's stored in a library then that the whole region has access to. So if you have a non-standard load, we'll have a dedicated rigging arrangement for that. And if we don't have one, we'll develop one, which is how the system works. And also as well, just to come full circle in terms of the incident in Germany, wherever we've got lift plans in place on all offshore wind turbine transition pieces now, we have mandatory exclusion zones during lifting operations as soon as the load is above head height. So you're expected to retreat off the transition piece and actually into the base of the tower. So there's a doorway in the base of the tower. You can, if need be, you can still observe. So some of the key benefits to standardization then. So it leverages all the best practice and lessons learned across the whole region. They're captured and incorporated into a single lift plan. It ensures that the safest methods for lifting operations are adopted by the whole region because we then mandate them into the standardized lift plan. A small team of competent lift planners can manage a huge workload. So we have effectively, using this system, we have 3 appointed persons that manage the lifting operations across around, well, we estimate it to be just over 3,000 lifting appliances, just through using standardization. It eliminates the mass need for repetition of the same work at site level. And it reduces any divergence, which is very, very common when it's handled at site level. And yeah, the optimization of lifting accessories and lifting bags has resulted in improved productivity and obviously improved safety because we're carrying out less lifting operations wherever we can. And that, Stuart, is the end of my presentation.
Thanks very much, Danny. So, any questions for Danny? Put them in the Q&A box. And we've got one last presentation, so you can just stop sharing. Thank you very much. And we hand over to Alan. So, Alan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And it's been interesting so far, and hopefully I can kind of capture everything, particularly around the themes of dropped object prevention and some of the lessons that we've all learned as an industry and how we've kind of shaped that into a resource of best practice. So I've got a few slides like everybody else. I like the high visual kind of content. Let's say that representing such an important initiative, particularly drops, has been it's an absolute pleasure to be able to stand here and talk to you on behalf of drops. I'm really talking on behalf of everybody that has supported drops. All of these industries are all doing the same thing. It's 100% focus on dropped object prevention. I know we're across the energy sector, but there are many more besides. We've got everybody from fastenings right the way through to the oil companies as well. What we're trying to achieve here is a second nature dropped object prevention strategy, something that we can all kind of easily refer to. The underlying principles, some common practices, without it being too complicated. We're just kind of rewinding and thinking, well, the common theme here is what have we learned? We've all learned, hey, dropped objects in particular during lifting, they can harm, they have harmed, they can kill, and they have killed. So there we are. And what have I learned from some of the data that we've received from that? Quite an interesting presentation we were working with Leah 2 or 3 years ago. Was where do you kind of commonly think these dropped objects come from? And based on the injuries, it's a good question to ask. Where do you think you're going to be struck by a dropped object during lifting activities? Almost everybody thinks you're going to be hit on the head. Already today, we've seen that, well, dropped objects can fall from any height. But from the point of view of what we're exposed to, or the cone of exposure, the significant injuries to hands and feet and arms and extremities, the significant injuries as a result of deflections whilst loading cargo, and as well as things that do hit you on the head. But I thought that was quite a fascinating kind of subject to kind of think, well, where do dropped objects come from? Are they always above our heads? Are they always involved in just the lift or just the cargo? Actually, well, when we start to study all of these incidents, and you can see dropped objects that cause is something we can look at, but the consequences is typically the lessons that we're learning. The equipment damage as a result of dropped objects, the asset damage, the environmental damage, the potential for damage to our reputation too. That drops necessarily isn't just a safety initiative. There's an opportunity here to start thinking about the integrity of our equipment, the integrity of our operations too. Again, from the exposure point of view, it's not always just the cargo. This is an old incident, but a great slideshow that's part of the packs that you can get from drops, freely downloadable because they've been shared by others. It's something where we can see, well, somebody got real lucky here, but it's a load. It's something that hasn't been secured during loading. It seems to be a common theme. But then what about everything else? Well, there's crane parts. There's the structures that we use in lifting. Crane boom rests, the lights that are swinging around on cranes, all of these have become dropped objects. The ancillary items, the tools that we use to repair cranes, the maintenance tasks. We've even got the occasional surprise. Could even be lumps of grease falling from the cranes, and even nuts, bolts, and screws. And from significant heights, when you start to look at the science behind these, you can then start to really appreciate that there's a whole broad range of dropped object potentials, and even the nuts and bolts can have severe consequences. So what can we do about it? Well, again, you've seen this list of common causes in a previous show, and it's great that through sharing, we're able to provide these lists, but make sure we use them, because these are the ones that kind of trigger the thought process in the risk assessment. There's many to consider here, but the one I think that's a common theme, I think we're all discussing at the moment, is the human factors or the error traps. There are so many resources out there which have captured all of our learnings in all of these areas, but I think human factors and the error traps are certainly worth focusing on. Through organizations such as IOGP, I'm making reference to a specific publication here again, which is free, specifically focusing on lifting and hoisting and recommended practice. It's captured all these shared best practices and the safe lifting principles. It's also considered the management system elements so that it becomes part of the management process. And of course, there are plenty of checklists and templates that we can use too, many of which have been discussed in the previous presentations. The classifications of lifts, the lift plan guidance. There's plenty of golden rules and things like color coding, all of these things that have all come together to make a suite of best practice when it comes to lifting. But again, when you start to introduce the concept of human factors or human performance, or the error traps, there are many other resources to have a look at, and including on the toolbox too. There's so many good resources that help us think about the potential for adaptation. The potential for perhaps generic lift plans are probably error traps if you think about it like that. But all of these are still generic tools, particularly in my mind, because when it comes to dropped objects, we've got to be specific. Dropped objects, particularly as a result of the unplanned or inadvertent release of gravity, that's something that really we can't isolate from the work site. Gravity is a constant. It's something that we have to prevent its release. So when it comes to dropped object prevention, we've got to be specific. We've got to focus on what those potential dropped objects are. In developing a lot of this best practice, again, lots of really handy ideas and prompts that have all come through that have kind of built the program or contributed to the program. Again, they're all have that same common theme that we can work our way through a series of steps which are applicable to all hazards. But when it comes to dropped objects, we need to take a step back and be specific, because the one thing we cannot do is isolate gravity. So when we do talk about the risk assessment part, the identification of the hazard, the understanding of the hazard has to be a specific reference to the static and dynamic potential of dropped objects. The controls that we have at our disposal, we need to know how we manage those and verify them. open-ended questions during Toolbox talks. We need to use the prompts that we've got that help us with that. We've got plenty of them. The equipment inspection, that's the part where we can start to really focus in on what exactly will prevent the release of gravity. What's the engineered control? What's that captive eye? What's that locking feature? What's the secondary retention device, the split pin or the locking nut? What is it that ensures that we won't inadvertently release gravity? And then what have we got to respond? How are we going to recover? Are there any safety securing devices that we can use? That equipment inspection is quite a critical thing. And when it comes to the lift, that cone of exposure, we've got some tools there that can help, particularly when we're starting to consider things like deflections. How far can things go? How far out should we consider our barriers to be, so that we can then refocus our minds to go back to the start and think about how we can maybe just verify or change or improve some of those preventive controls. There's also some great products like the walkthrough, talkthrough. So when it comes to improvements, because ultimately all of this material has all come from the common sharing of best practice, walking through and talking through the task and identifying where we can improve is great too. Reliable securing, a fantastic document from Dropped Objects Prevention Scheme, which gives us an overview of different fastenings. It gives us specific detail on how these should be used, because ultimately these are all the items that will prevent dropped objects. Likewise, when specific lifting equipment, different types of equipment, what to look out for, how to inspect items, how to control tools, how to create inventories. There's so much best practice that we've brought from many industries. For me, sometimes using the tools at height concept as an example of a good dropped object management scheme starts with that inventory, starts with approved tools that we can identify with as being original equipment manufactured, as being drop tested, as being suitable for use at height. And then that combination of secure toolboxes, the ability to track and trace the tools, and then to respond to any remaining risks with things like our lanyards and our tie-offs and nets and drops mats and many other items besides. And then to verify everything has been brought back. So there are lots of products available when it comes to tools, but it's interesting when you look at these and you look at how they've developed over time through working with the drops community, that we can have specific toolkits for specific applications, toolkits that belong to cranes, toolkits that belong to task-specific activities. And there's also the cargo itself, the inspections of cargo. Within reliable securing, we make reference to that, but we've also got, from the work groups that focus on particularly transportation, all of the best practices in what to check on loads, on cargo units, the differences between each of these, particularly how they are used on location, the common areas where we need to address in our inspections, and also specific checklists, tags, and handy prompts to make sure that we are making use of all of these learnings that we've gathered over time. Reliable securing, as an example, it's common content that we've all kind of come together and agreed within the oil and gas sector, but it's also readily adaptable. It's a common best practice, but it's also common engineering best practice. It's a fantastic training aid. It's something that we recommend is used as a worksite prompt, and it's adaptable too, and it's a free thing to download and use. And if you look at other industries, particularly the offshore wind sector, it's a great example of how cross-industry collaboration has resulted in free use of that content. And all we've needed to do here is change out the pictures to make it more specific to that sector. But up front in this document, we'll be talking about fastenings and risk assessment, what to look out for, the considerations during that task risk assessment. These common prompts and common cues are all based on some common best practice principles. So I would urge you to kind of explore that book. How can you get it? It's all available on Drops Online. There's lots to have a look at there. they've got plenty more once you start exploring things like the safety alerts, the checklists, the prompt cards. But then we've also got these specific products, the booklets that we've made recommendations to be part of your management system, or for you to use as training aids, or to use as systematic inspections for your assets. But one thing I wanted to finish off with, when you think about that cone of exposure, one of the more recent tools we've had, which is again based on that science of what happens when an item falls from height, is what happens when it strikes something on the way down. What about deflections? This is a tool that is available. You just download it. It's an Excel tool. You can input the height at which the item could be dropped, input the height at which there could be a deflection. So you might consider maybe a walkway or something around a tower. And then the graphic will illustrate what happens when the item strikes the deflection point. So here we go. If we started with a 30-meter height, and we dropped an item 6 meters above that base level, the ground level, it strikes, let's say, a guardrail. The deflection point can be within 5 meters if it strikes or glances that handrail. If we change that deflection point, we can quickly see just how far items can travel. And also we can start playing around with it to start to realize, well, sometimes we can almost start creating scenarios where things can continually bounce and find their way into areas where we'd never expect them to find them. These tools are, you could design these to say, if you want to fail safely, this is where you can put your barricades. But for me, an understanding of the science, or the understanding of gravity, should take us back to the start and really start identifying with what is it that's going to drop? How is it going to drop? How can we prevent it? How can we secure it? Ultimately, how can we eliminate it? And then start to appreciate that all of these other resources, particularly around human factors, particularly around your activity-specific variations on the drops themes, is you make sure we're referring to those. There are a broad range of industry best practices. Take the time to explore them all. Many other industries besides, they're all willing to share. So what do we do to prevent dropped objects? So again, some common themes here. Let's respect gravity. Respect all hazards, but respect gravity as being something just that slightly bit different. We can eliminate what we don't need, but take the time out to discuss these task steps. Remember that gravity is a key part of lifting, but it's also a hazard at the worksite. OEM, original equipment manufacturer recommendations and fastenings and fittings and applications, and that is something that we need to focus on. Ultimately, our equipment has been designed for purpose. Make sure we are using it correctly, it's properly installed, and it's maintained and inspected throughout every step of the task. And if we understand our fastenings, we understand our controls, we can question the robustness of them. We can start to ask questions ourselves. Is this a suitable way to lift? Is this a suitable method of securement? Have we had an opportunity to take a step back and review the checklist? Sharing best practice with others is always a good thing to do, and remain vigilant throughout, because in a lot of cases, perhaps we don't know when the next dropped object is going to occur. We can have all the great controls in place. So if we get involved and share best practice, I believe that we can make a difference. So I've kind of hammered away through that. Hopefully I've nailed that for you, Stuart, but I'm open for any questions, but please feel free to explore these resources and share them and adapt them to suit. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Okay, so if I can ask if you can stop sharing your screen, and if I can ask the presenters just to turn your cameras and microphones on, and we've got, I don't know, well, you usually would stay just until 1/2 if you can stay a bit longer, then please do. But we've really got time for a few questions. So let's have a look. First question here. So we saw that human factors was listed as a cause of lifting incidents. So the question here is, I thought that, what's happened here? My screen's gone funny. The question here is, I thought that human factors was a discipline. So how can it be one of the top 10 causes for dropped objects? So what do we mean when we say that human factors is a cause of lifting incidents?
Well, I'm just trying to get my thoughts ready. I think what we mean then is that the fundamental issues behind what causes a dropped object are down to something we can change in the behaviours of people and the cultures of people.
Okay. Anyone? Any other comments on that one? Or, I mean, I think you're right there, because you also, you noted that a number of the other causes around procedures and other things are all part of human factors. Of course, human factors covers having good procedures that are clear and workable and all those sorts of things. So, okay, let me. So we talked quite a lot about lifting operations and the competency of people. So the question here, it's quite a long question. I'll try and summarize it. But so lifting operations clearly require quite a lot of specific competencies, including mathematics, physics, attention to detail, planning, etc., communication. So what certification is required for the lifting team? The banksman as well as others in the lifting team. And does the certification or training really focus on the right competencies?
I guess I'll maybe throw my hat into the ring with some of this, because this is some of the stuff that we've been working on recently. One of my big concerns, obviously, in my presentation, I talked about a lack of adequate planning, and in the renewable sector, there's been a gaping hole in training and competence assessment of individuals planning, managing, and supervising lifting operations. If we look as an organisation inwardly at the people that we have trained and competent to plan and manage lifting operations, most of them, not all of them, but most of them have been trained in the UK. There are quite a lot of training courses available, things like the CPCS appointed person. I think there's an NPAWS equivalent. You have LOLA competent person in oil and gas. One of the things that we've been working on, and it was actually released last week, we've been working with a PITO to transfer the knowledge from oil and gas, perhaps into renewables, and develop a standard specifically aimed at teaching people how to plan lifting operations effectively, that goes down the route of teaching them how to derate slings, teaching them about sling angles and selection of right equipment and so on and so forth. So I think that there are still gaps. But I think that there's work undergoing to try and close those gaps, certainly in the renewable sector. And I'm only answering on behalf of renewables, given that that's where I work at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is okay, so who bears the responsibility for accidents during lifting operations that are mostly performed by contractors? So under UK safety laws, who bears the responsibility?
I think, it's quite a broad question, that, and I guess it depends on under what circumstances the lifting operations were undertaken. Traditionally in the UK, there are two different methodologies of undertaking lifting operations. So you have the CPA terms and conditions, which would set out whether you take a contract lift service or whether you take a crane hire only, and you would internally plan and manage that yourself. They also set out things in terms of who owns liability, for the insurance requirements, etc. But fundamentally, I guess the answer to the question is whoever holds the responsibility, the employer responsibility under LOLA, technically, I would say is responsible. And where we have a lot of contractors working and carrying out lifting operations on our site, we are expected by the HSE to carry out a certain amount of due diligence to make sure that they are following the legal requirements, if you like.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Nick, just a question here for you. So looking at your presentation conclusion, do you share the view that developing a detailed lift plan template that captures all lifting operation risk areas, in addition to SME final review and approval of the completed lift plan, will be a game changer?
That's a quite specific question, and I was looking at it earlier, and you know, I'd have to say it's not clear to me that it would. The thing is, with this, once you start getting into templates, then you can't cover everything. There has to be at some point, some of the responsibility can't come from the centre, be it the IMCA or the G+, but from the individual corporation, individual company. So some of the detail, some of the template, you're not going to cover everything. We can go a long way, but a detailed lift plan template that covered everything would be pages and pages and pages and pages. So it's not clear to me that it would be a game changer. That's sticking my neck out, but I think that's fair to say, I think.
Thank you. I think sort of, Danny, you know, in your presentation, you'd obviously shown that because of, I guess, in some ways, the uniqueness of your operations, you've got a lot of control over the equipment, the design of the turbines, and there's quite a bit of standardization going on there. So I can understand how you've managed to standardize. I mean, I read that question as being sort of perhaps in response to some things you were saying around, you know, standardization of the lift plans, but so I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think we obviously the questions related to major accidents, and I'll be honest, the majority of major accidents occur across a much broader spectrum of lifting operations within renewables. Obviously, a lot of the construction work, the pre-assembly work, mobilization, considerably sized lifts, utilizing cranes to really high utilization figures. It's not uncommon for vessel cranes to be 99% plus in terms of utilization. So it's quite a broad question, but common causal factors that are identified in, and I can only speak on SGRE's behalf. Obviously, whilst I work in the renewable industry, I'm not privy to data from competitors and contractors, etc. But common causal factors through high potential incidents tend to be inadequate or non-existent lift plans, lack of documentation reviews and approvals, competence issues with lifting personnel, both internally and externally, use of non-approved contractors, deviation from procedures, an inappropriate use and failure of equipment. And in terms of some of the things that SGRE implement to try and control those, there's a raft of stuff, to be honest, and I'll just kind of talk through some of them. So one of the things that we do in the NEMA region is ensure that cranes are configured correctly when they arrive on site. It's a big issue with particularly mobile cranes overturning. So using datum checks as an example to make sure that the crane's configured correctly. So we ask for particular measurements to be supplied to us before a crane arrives on site. And when it arrives, we check that datum. And if the datum matches, we've got a pretty good understanding that the crane is configured correctly. If there's any disparity between the two, it's indicative that there are issues. We have critical task competence pathways. So a lot of our lifting operations are quite involved with other significant jobs. There's a lot of mechanical work involved as well. So for different heavy lift jobs, lifting rotors, lifting gearboxes, etc., there's a whole raft of competence requirements that you need to be signed off to be able to do that job. We've done a significant amount of work in terms of removing personnel from areas at risk of entrapment using technology, guide pins, camera systems, and so on and so forth. Also reducing numbers of people wherever we can. Obviously, the fewer people are exposed to the risk, the fewer people that you can hurt. And also updated contract HSE requirements to actually specifically set out some minimum requirements for lifting operations, and making sure that all contractors of critical services, which lifting are, get what's called a first service evaluation. So we actually evaluate the first job that they do for us in detail to make sure that they're following the processes and procedures that they need to. So I guess a bit of a long-winded answer, but covering quite a lot of different topics.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I think that's all the questions we've had. So I just want to thank our speakers. So Danny, Alan, Nick, Utibe, thank you very much for your presentations and for speaking today. And thank you for those who asked questions from the audience. Just a reminder, our next webinar is the 12th of July, and that covers just culture, I believe. And the recording from this webinar will be made available in a few days. And so do watch out for an email, and we'll try to include some links to some of the resources that that our speakers showed us today. So thank you very much again to our speakers. Have a great rest of the day to you and to all our listeners, and hope to see you next time.